If you think Morgan Freeman's life has been nothing but success, fame, and smooth sailing, you're about to discover a truth that will shock you. Because behind that calm smile and legendary voice is a lifetime of pain the world never saw. Before the awards, before the iconic roles, before Hollywood finally listened, Morgan walked through decades of struggle so heavy that most people would have collapsed under it. This is the part of his story no interview shows, no movie reveals, and no audience ever imagined. And once you hear what he survived to reach 88, you'll understand why his journey is not just inspiring, it's one of the most heartbreaking stories in Hollywood history. At 88, when the world looks at Morgan Freeman and sees the calm voice, the iconic presence, the legendary wisdom that seems almost carved into his soul, very few truly understand the path that shaped him. The slow and painful climb that carved every wrinkle, every breath, and every quiet pause he takes before speaking. People see the success, the awards, the iconic roles, the unforgettable narration, the commanding screen presence that feels larger than life. But what they don't see is everything he carried on his back long before Hollywood even knew his name. Everything he lost, everything he waited for, and everything he fought against in absolute silence. Because Morgan Freeman wasn't born into opportunity, he wasn't handed a path, he wasn't welcomed into rooms with open arms, and he was never told, "You're destined to be great." Instead, he grew up in a world where nobody expected anything from a young, black boy born in 1937. Mississippi, a world of poverty, segregation, and systemic rejection. A world where the idea of becoming an actor wasn't just unlikely. People considered it impossible. And yet, inside this quiet, observant boy lived a dream he didn't dare say out loud. A dream so far away it didn't even look real. But a dream he couldn't let go of no matter how hard life pushed him down. He was raised not in one stable home, but in a shifting pattern of places, moving from one state to another as his parents struggled for work, living with relatives, sleeping in cramped spaces, and learning early that nothing in life stays still. That constant movement created in him a habit of watching, studying, absorbing the world around him, noticing every detail, every emotion, every hidden truth in the people he encountered. That habit would later become the foundation of his remarkable acting. But at that time, it was simply the observation of a child trying to understand a world that rarely made sense. Poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a shadow that followed him everywhere. There were days he didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Days where dreams felt like a luxury he didn't deserve. Days where he wondered if life had already decided his future for him. And yet, even then, in the quiet corners of his childhood, something inside him refused to break. But life tested him again and again. When most children his age were encouraged to explore ambitions, Morgan was reminded of limitations. The world he grew up in wasn't gentle, and it certainly wasn't fair. Segregation wasn't an idea, it was his daily reality. Racism wasn't something in history books, it shaped where he could go, what he could do, how people looked at him, and how people decided his worth without knowing anything about him. And when a young Morgan dreamed of acting, he wasn't met with support or understanding. Instead, he was met with raised eyebrows, dismissive laughs, and disbelief. People told him acting wasn't a real job, not for someone like him. They told him to forget it, to choose something practical, something realistic, something the world would allow him to do. But something in him refused to let that dream die, even when it seemed foolish. In school, he discovered a stage for the first time. Not a grand stage, but a small one. One that allowed him to pretend, to escape, to transform. The moment he stepped into character, he felt something he had never felt before: freedom. A kind of freedom he couldn't find anywhere else. And yet even that was taken from him for a while. Because as he grew older, life forced him to choose survival over dreams. There wasn't money for acting school. There weren't connections. There wasn't a path. So he enlisted in the Air Force, believing maybe this was the future he was supposed to accept. He trained, he worked, he did everything expected of him. But deep down, something didn't feel right. He looked at the runway, the planes, the uniform, and realized he was living someone else's story, not his own. The dream he tried to bury kept resurfacing. It whispered in the quiet moments. It followed him even when he tried to let it go. And so one day, with nothing but a stubborn hope and a nearly empty pocket, he walked away from the military and returned to the world with a decision that shocked everyone. He was going to chase the dream that nobody believed in. But Hollywood did not welcome him, not even close. Instead, he spent years doing small roles, low-paying jobs, performing in tiny theaters, struggling to afford rent, eating meals that barely qualified as meals, and living in a state of quiet but constant uncertainty. And while other actors his age found success, got breakthrough roles, built careers, Morgan faced doors that simply did not open. Casting directors didn't see him as a leading man. They didn't see him as versatile. They didn't see him at all. They saw a black actor, too old, too serious, too calm, too different for Hollywood's narrow expectations. He was typecast, dismissed, overlooked, and rejected so many times that any ordinary person would have quit. But Morgan Freeman wasn't ordinary. He kept going even when the world told him the window had closed, even when he was past the age when most actors give up, even when his career looked like nothing more than a fading possibility. And then, slowly, very slowly, the world began to notice him. First in small TV roles, then in stage performances, then in supporting characters that people couldn't forget. He didn't explode into fame. He grew into it, piece by piece, role by role, heartbreak by heartbreak. And yet the heartbreak never truly stopped. Even when success finally came, it arrived with sacrifices, broken relationships, long periods of loneliness, the heavy weight of expectations, and the constant pressure of reinventing himself in an industry that changes faster than anyone can keep up. And as the decades passed, he carried all of it quietly, without complaint, without spectacle, without asking for sympathy. But there is one truth people often forget: success does not erase pain. Fame does not erase the struggles that shaped a person. And age does not erase the weight of an entire lifetime spent pushing against walls that were never supposed to move. At 88, people see the strength, the calm, the certainty. But what they don't see is the lifelong exhaustion that comes from fighting battles that should never have been fought in the first place. They don't see the dreams he waited decades for. They don't see the opportunities that were denied simply because of the time he was born into. They don't see the quiet moments where he wonders how different his life could have been if Hollywood had recognized him earlier, if the world had been kinder, if the path hadn't been so steep, so unforgiving, so unbelievably long. And above all, they don't see the emotional toll of becoming a legend late in life, after spending more than half his years being treated as invisible. Because the true tragedy of Morgan Freeman isn't found in dramatic headlines. It isn't found in fake rumors or fabricated stories. The real tragedy is the story of a man who had the talent from the beginning, but had to wait until the world was ready for him, even though he was ready all along. This is only the beginning of his journey, a journey that becomes heavier, deeper, and even more heartbreaking as the years go on. And as Morgan Freeman stepped deeper into adulthood, carrying the weight of years that had shaped him far too early, he realized something that many people never understand until much later in life. Talent means nothing without opportunity, and opportunity means nothing without timing. And for Morgan, timing was never on his side. He entered his 30s with a dream that still belonged to a much younger man, a dream most people would have abandoned long ago. Yet he held onto it with a quiet defiance, even when everything around him suggested it was too late. While others his age bought homes, built families, and settled into stable careers, Morgan was living in small apartments, taking jobs that barely paid bills, and performing in theaters where the audience sometimes didn't fill even half the seats. And every night, when he stepped off stage, he wrestled with the same silent question that would haunt him for decades. What if none of this works out? What if he was chasing something that would never become real? But quitting never crossed his mind. Not truly, not in a way that could break him. Because acting wasn't just a profession for Morgan Freeman, it was the language of his soul. It was the place where he felt seen, even if the world refused to look at him. It was the one part of himself he could never abandon, no matter how difficult the journey became. But Hollywood remained stubbornly closed. He faced audition after audition where no one looked up, no one listened, no one cared. He heard the same lines repeatedly: "You're too old, you're not leading man material, there's no role here for you." And yet each rejection built another layer of resilience around him. What people didn't understand was that Morgan wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing purpose, a sense of belonging, a place where his voice mattered. When he finally landed a role on a children's television show, it wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't the break he dreamed of, but it was something real. Something that allowed him to breathe. It gave him visibility, but visibility didn't erase the struggles of daily life. Even with steady work, he was still barely surviving. His personal life grew complicated. His relationships strained under financial pressure, long working hours, and emotional distance created by a man who poured so much of himself into a craft that gave him almost nothing in return. And while he continued to move forward, life kept pulling him back with tragedies and disappointments that would have ended lesser spirits. But Morgan kept walking, and then came the stage, the place where he had always belonged. His performance in The Mighty Gents caught people's attention, not because he fit into Hollywood's neat categories, but precisely because he didn't. He was different. He had a presence that demanded attention. He had a voice that carried through silence. He had a depth that could not be replicated. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to notice. And yet, the recognition he deserved still lagged behind the reality of his talent. When he gave the performance of a lifetime in Street Smart, earning an Oscar nomination that could have changed everything, Hollywood still hesitated. It wasn't that they didn't see his brilliance. It was that they didn't know what to do with it. He didn't fit their idea of a star. But the truth was, Morgan Freeman didn't need to fit their idea. He was redefining it. Even then, even after critical acclaim, even after people finally spoke his name with respect, the roles didn't come easily. He was still fighting, still pushing, still waiting for the kind of opportunity other actors received without asking. And while the world assumed his success was secure, he knew better. He still lived with uncertainty. He still lived with doubt. He still lived with the weight of knowing that one wrong step could send everything crashing down. Throughout these years, he struggled privately with exhaustion, loneliness, and the emotional burden of constantly proving himself in an industry that had never seen him as its first choice. But he never complained, never lashed out, never asked for sympathy. Instead, he let the work speak for him. And then, something extraordinary happened, something that revealed both the beauty and tragedy of Morgan Freeman's story. He became a star in his 50s, an age when most actors are preparing for their careers to fade. Morgan's career finally ignited. Driving Miss Daisy, Glory, Lean on Me, these weren't just films. They were moments of recognition that had been denied to him for decades. Suddenly, the world looked at him as if he had arrived overnight. But what they didn't understand was that his overnight success had taken more than 30 years. 30 years of being ignored, discounted, and underestimated. 30 years of barely surviving. 30 years of watching others get opportunities he knew he deserved. And yet, he stayed kind. He stayed humble. He stayed steady. But fame brings its own shadows. With success came expectations, scrutiny, and the quiet pressure of maintaining an image the world wanted from him. He became the symbol of wisdom, of calm authority, of moral clarity. People expected him to be unshakable, flawless, untouchable. But no one is unbreakable, not even Morgan Freeman. Behind the calm smile, behind the composed interviews, behind the powerful voice that narrated entire generations, lived a man who had endured a lifetime of emotional hardship. A man who rarely had the space to show weakness. A man who carried the enormous weight of being everyone's symbol of strength. And that is its own kind of tragedy. Because when the world sees you as strong, they stop seeing you as human. They stop asking if you're okay. They stop acknowledging your pain. And Morgan Freeman, despite all his accomplishments, lived with the burden of invisibility long after he became famous, this time not because he wasn't seen, but because he wasn't allowed to be vulnerable. As he entered his 70s and 80s, he carried not only his history, but the collective expectations of millions. People saw him as a legend, an icon, a voice of wisdom, but they didn't see the cost of being that man for so long. They didn't see the sacrifices. They didn't see the internal battles. They didn't see the emotional toll of decades spent fighting for a place the world wouldn't easily give him. And in the quiet moments, the weight of that truth sits heavy on his shoulders. Because the tragedy of Morgan Freeman is not that he failed, he didn't. It's that he succeeded so late and carried so much pain to get there. And when the world finally praised him, he was already a man shaped by decades of struggle. At 88, the world sees strength, but behind that strength is a lifetime of storms that he survived alone. Now, at 88, when the world looks at Morgan Freeman and sees the calm dignity, that seems almost eternal. The truth is far more fragile, far more human, far more heartbreaking than anyone imagines. Because age doesn't simply arrive, it accumulates. It gathers everything a person has lived, everything they have endured, everything they tried to forget, and it places it quietly on their shoulders. And Morgan Freeman, after a lifetime of struggle, rejection, late triumph, and relentless expectations, carries that weight with the same quiet strength he has carried everything else. But that strength has come at a cost. As he grew older and the world finally recognized his greatness, a strange irony emerged. The more iconic he became, the more invisible his inner life became. People praised him, celebrated him, quoted him, admired him, but very few ever stopped to consider the emotional reality behind the legend. They didn't see the exhaustion of a man who waited longer than most. People lived to be seen. They didn't see the years he lost while waiting for opportunities he should have had from the beginning. They didn't see the quiet moments where he wondered what his life could have been if Hollywood had opened its doors just a little earlier. Because behind every powerful role, every unforgettable narration, every performance that shaped generations, was a man who had already lived through decades of disappointment before the world finally decided he was worthy of attention. And age only intensified that awareness. As he moved through his 70s and 80s, the world applauded him as if he had conquered everything. But Morgan knew there were battles inside him that never truly ended. There is a particular loneliness that comes with late success, a loneliness that grows deeper when people treat you as a symbol rather than a person. The world expects wisdom from him, expects calm, expects strength, expects answers. People approach him with reverence, not conversation. They praise him as if he is above struggle, above fear, above doubt. But even legends bleed, even icons break, even the strongest voices tremble when no one is listening. And Morgan Freeman has lived much of his later life in the space between admiration and isolation, between being loved by millions and truly understood by very few. His voice became the voice of God, of presidents, of narrators who carry truth and gravitas. But the world often forgot to ask, what does the man behind that voice carry inside his own heart? Because the truth is, Morgan Freeman didn't just rise above adversity, he paid for every step of that rise with pieces of himself. His personal life has been shaped by complicated relationships, heartbreaks, emotional distance, and the pressure of constantly being on, constantly being the wise, steady presence the world expects him to be. He has endured moments of deep loss, moments of public scrutiny, moments where the media twisted narratives or speculated about his life in ways that reduced his humanity to headlines. And through all of it, he had to remain composed because the world does not allow its icons to fall apart. People forget that the older a person becomes, the more they carry memories, regrets, what ifs. The quiet awareness that time is no longer endless. At 88, Morgan Freeman knows he has lived more years than he has left. He knows the world sees him as timeless, but he feels the reality of time every single day. He feels it in the slowness of mornings, in the heaviness of silence, in the awareness that he has outlived many of the people who shaped his life. He feels it when he looks back on the decades he lost to an industry that wasn't ready for him. He feels it when he thinks about the young man he once was, the boy from Mississippi who had dreams nobody believed in, the struggling actor in his 20s and 30s who waited in audition rooms that led nowhere, the middle-aged man who kept being told he was too old before he even had a chance to begin. And now, decades later, the tragedy lies not only in what he endured, but in the fact that so much of his life's beauty and brilliance came so late that he barely had time to enjoy it fully. Fame brought him admiration, but not peace. Success brought him recognition, but not simplicity. Legacy brought him immortality on screen, but not relief from the weight of everything he took to get there. And yet, despite everything, Morgan remains grounded, humble, and steady. He gives interviews with a sense of presence that feels like a man who has made peace with himself, even if the world never fully understood him. But behind the calm is a lifetime of storms he survived without asking for help. Behind the steady, voice is a heart that has known rejection far longer than it has known praise. Behind the iconic smile is a man who learned to hide pain so deeply that the world assumed he never had any at all. In his later years, Morgan Freeman has become something rare, an actor whose mere presence elevates everything around him, a symbol of endurance, a reminder that greatness does not always arrive early, a testament to patience, resilience, and faith in oneself. But there is also a quiet sadness in that reality. Because for Morgan, success was not the reward for endless effort. It was the apology the world gave him decades too late. And that is the unspoken tragedy. He spent more years fighting than he did celebrating. More years proving his worth than enjoying what he had earned. More years in the shadows than under the spotlight. And now, as he looks at the life behind him, he carries not bitterness, but a deep sense of reflection, a recognition of everything he survived, everything he learned, and everything he had to become in order to outlast the obstacles placed before him. At 88, he understands the fragility of time better than ever. He understands the cost of dreams. He understands the price of perseverance. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that the world only sees the legend, not the man who walked through decades of heartbreak to become one. But despite all of that, there is something profoundly beautiful about Morgan Freeman's story. Because he is not defined by his struggles, but by the fact that he rose above them. He is not defined by how long it took, but by the fact that he never stopped climbing. He is not defined by the doors that closed, but by the ones he opened for generations to follow. He proved that greatness has no deadline. He proved that talent can survive decades of neglect. He proved that even when the world ignores you, you can still become unforgettable. And he proved that a man's worth is not determined by how early he succeeds, but by how fiercely he refuses to give up. That is the power of Morgan Freeman's life. That is the lesson within his tragedy. That is the truth beneath the legend. And at 88, when he sits quietly, far from cameras and crowded rooms, he doesn't need applause or awards or attention. He has already given the world more than enough. What he holds now is something much deeper, the hard-earned peace of a man who survived everything life threw at him and still stood tall. He is living proof that the road to greatness is not always bright, not always fair, and not always kind, but it can still lead to something extraordinary. And when people speak of him long after he is gone, they will remember the voice, the presence, the wisdom, but those who look deeper will remember the journey, the struggle, the resilience, and the quiet tragedy of a man who became a legend not because life was easy, but because he never stopped walking, even when the road felt endless. And that, more than anything, is the true story of Morgan Freeman at 88, a story of pain and perseverance, of heartbreak and triumph, of being unseen for far too long, and finally becoming the kind of immortal presence that no one can ever overlook again.